My name is Tsungai Zenge. I'm one of the lead editors of this 2019 status report on biological invasions and a senior scientist in the unit at SANBI who works on this report. The purpose of this presentation is to go through the process of compiling the report and to discuss some of the key findings and their implications. This pre-prepared presentation is given by different members of the team who compiled the report to showcase some of the SANBI staff involved in this important work. To jump straight into the issues we are faced with, there are a variety of invasive species, and they have a range of impacts that vary from site to site. In mountain catchments, we are seeing pine trees using up water, increasing the intensity of fires and crowding out biodiversity. In arid areas, we see prosopis again reducing water and affecting livestock. Parthenium weed is invading in the west, and it has serious impacts on people and similar impacts on cattle and other grazers, meaning they can't feed. Finally, alien freshwater fishes are invading across South Africa, killing our native fishes and other organisms. So essentially, instead of diverse streams and rivers, there is nothing left but a few individual of invasive species. I've picked these examples because South Africa is a global hotspot of invasive trees and invasive freshwater fishes. But there are many other problematic invasions. Perhaps the most concerning recent invasion is that of the Polyphogus short-haul borer. The beetle was detected in 2017 as part of a SANBI-funded project, but was already fairly widespread across the country. It has had a devastating effect on street trees in Johannesburg, and projections are that it will kill all oak trees in Stellenbosch. Approximately 17 native trees are reproductive hosts, so they will die if they are infested. It is likely to become a major pest of avocados. A study in preparation has projected future costs to be several billion rands per year if no action is taken. So how has South Africa responded to this challenge? Interventions put in place so far include the promulgation of disaster management legislation. The proposed emergency intervention and management measures have been published for public comment under both biodiversity and agricultural legislation. The Polyphogus short-haul borer is declared as a quarantine pest in terms of the Agricultural Pest Act, and so import regulations are in place. Control measures have been developed focusing specifically on the agricultural host crops. Research into biological control is underway, and various training courses have been held around the country to improve the knowledge of the issues, increase rates of detection, and to promote best practice in management. This is overseen by an interdepartmental steering committee that meets every 2 months with a wide range of stakeholders and affected parties. As can be seen by the case of the Polyphogus short-haul borer, biological invasions are a complex, multifaceted problem requiring a multifaceted response. Biological invasions have never been more topical, and international attention will be increasing over the coming years. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services will launch their report assessing invasive alien species in May 2023, and South Africa is well represented, with SANBI's own Dr. Sebatalo Rahlao as one of the chapter lead authors. At a national level, the need for a response to biological invasions is enshrined in the Constitution, specifically Section 24, which states that South Africans have a right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being. Several laws directly and indirectly address this challenge. The one most specifically focused on biological invasions is the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act and its associated Alien and Invasive Species Regulations of 2014 that were most recently updated on the 1st of March 2021. Many government departments are involved, including the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the Department of Science and Innovation, and the Department of Health. As we will discuss, biological invasions represent a challenge to national development, but they also offer an opportunity for job creation. The response to issues involves many different stakeholders. For example, inspectors engaging with the pet trade, agricultural importers, tourists arriving at our borders, researchers across the country, municipality workers keeping our parks and roadsides clear of invasive vegetation, lawyers dealing with criminal prosecutions, and many more. But why do we need a report? At a basic level, the South African National Biodiversity Institute is mandated to produce such a report under the NAMBA, Alien and Invasive Species regulations. The report also sits within the context of South Africa's international agreements. In particular, the Convention on Biological Diversity 2020 Acquis Target 9 stated that by 2020, invasive alien species and pathways are identified and prioritized. Priority species are controlled or eradicated, and measures are put in place to manage pathways to prevent their introduction and establishment. The status report outlines information needed to assess how well South Africa has met this target, but we have also worked to ensure it speaks to future targets, in particular the ongoing discussion around the revised 2030 and 2050 targets, which focus on defining and scoring impact and assessing how effective management is. Fulfilling mandates is all very well, but it doesn't explain why a report is actually needed, so I wanted to step back and discuss this. In an ideal world, research is conducted that flows into policy. Policies are then implemented through specific interventions. The efficacy of the interventions are then monitored and evaluated, and these findings are used to improve management and direct research. But in the real world, things are more complicated. Different people do different things. Institutions might use different terms and they have different goals. And in many cases, there simply aren't any linkages there at all. This is where the status report comes in. It facilitates the link between foundational research and the monitoring and evaluations of interventions in a manner that can assist managers and policymakers. As per the 2014 regulations, reports are due every 3 years, so the first report was finalized based on data up to end of 2016. This report was the first such report anywhere in the world. As such, we did not have a format to copy, and the first report was naturally a first attempt. This new report is not simply an update in terms of numbers, but an upgrade in terms of the processes and the content. Parallel to the production of the report, the team was also involved in the production of an open access academic book. With close to 1,000 pages, it is the first encyclopedic review of the topic for South Africa, and it provided much of the basis for engagement with the scientific community. If you Google biological invasions in South Africa, you can get access to all the chapters online for free. Both the reports and the book were co-produced by the South African National Biodiversity Institute and the DSI NRF Center of Excellence for Invasion Biology. Before going further, I must acknowledge those involved. We are a core team of 9, and in the coming slides you will hear from several of us. But we also need to acknowledge contributions from a reference and advisory committee who oversaw the process and a whole range of contributing authors. People who provided detailed comments during the 2 rounds of public review that the report was subjected to, and 3 independent reviewers who looked over the whole of the final draft. When you put together all the institutions involved, either in the report or in the book, this is the picture you get. But the report relies on information from a much broader group. This report is the result of everyone working on biological invasions in South Africa. This picture shows the delegates of the National Symposium on Biological Invasions in 2019, which was co-hosted by the CIB and SANBI. I know most of you know what we mean by biological invasions, But just to recap, biological invasions are formally defined as the phenomena of and suite of processes that are involved in determining the transport of organisms to sites outside their native range by human activities and the fate of the organisms in their new ranges. What this means is that we need to look at biological invasions in terms of their pathways of introduction and spread. So in the example shown, it is both how the forestry industry introduced pines and how the pines spread from where they were planted. We also need to look at the species themselves, which pine species were introduced and what traits they have, including how they affect native plants and use of water. We also need to look at the invaded sites, as the suite of invasive species and the impacts they will cause will vary depending on local conditions. And finally, we need to look at what can be done to manage the pathways, control individual species, and to try and minimize the impacts that all invasive species have on particular sites. Therefore, the structure of the report is based on the definition of biological invasions itself. We will go through the key findings of each of these parts in turn. First, I will hand over to Caitlin to discuss the key findings on pathways.
Thank you, Tsungai. I will now be discussing the pathways component of the report. This component focuses on how humans have brought alien species into the country through a number of introduction pathways. Some alien species have been brought in legally, but many others have been brought in illegally or accidentally. Some alien species that have been introduced to other African countries have also spread into South Africa on their own steam. The report shows that due to human activities, new alien species continue to arrive in the country every year. The number of people and amounts of goods entering the country has not changed greatly over the last few years, and as a consequence, there has been no major increase in the rate at which new alien species are arriving. Importantly, these species continue to add to the number of invasive species already in the country. For example, the Polyphogus shot-hole borer, which Tsungai mentioned, was likely accidentally introduced when infested wood or wood products were imported. In order for us to prevent such harmful introductions in the future, we need to understand how, when, and where alien species are arriving. Recent exciting research on a number of introduction pathways has improved our understanding. This work has focused on pathways such as the medicinal plant trade and pet trade, which can include trade in alien species, and biofouling, which is when a marine organism attaches to a ship or boat and then is transported along with that vessel when it travels between regions. There are, however, many introduction pathways. The Convention on Biological Diversity's pathway classification framework recognizes 6 broad pathway categories that can be split into 44 subcategories. In the report, for each of these, we have assessed the current knowledge and given an indication of how they have changed since the first report. To give a few specific examples, almost 100 marine species have been introduced to South Africa through biofouling and when visiting ships have released their ballast water. These include a recently recorded crab from South America. Since the first report, the number of species known to have been introduced through both of these pathways has increased. The intra-African spread of alien species is also a growing concern. Over the last few years, a number of devastating agricultural pests that had been introduced to other African countries have been recorded in South Africa for the first time. These species either spread into the country through natural dispersal or were accidentally transported. They include the fall army worm, which was likely introduced to West Africa on airplanes and subsequently spread throughout the continent by flight. Other such species are the tomato leaf miner and the red palm mite. This highlights that biological invasions are a regional issue, and so although many government departments have taken action to prevent introductions, regional cooperation is required. Regional networks that collate and disseminate information on some invasive species do exist. For example, the Forest Invasive Species Network for Africa. However, these need to be expanded and strengthened. So what is being done to manage the introduction pathways? While many pathways are managed to some extent, effective protocols are increasingly being implemented to regulate legal introductions, and new technologies will soon enable inspectors to perform DNA analysis at ports of entry, thereby decreasing the time required to determine if a species has been legally imported. However, we will never be able to prevent all introductions, and some pathways, like ballast water, are not managed. Therefore, alien species will continue to be accidentally and illegally introduced, and so we will need to be prepared to manage those that slip through our biosecurity. Up next, Sia will be discussing the key findings from the species component.
Thanks, Caitlin. I will now be taking you through some of the key findings of the species chapter. The species chapter provides an updated assessment of which alien species are known to occur in South Africa, the abundance and extent of invasive species, and the impact of specific invasive species. A major part of this second report was to revise the species list, which is still an ongoing process. What's new, though, is that the list now uses international data standards for categorizing invasion status and pathways through which species were introduced. Set processes are in place to register changes to the list, and we are working towards meeting the FAIR data standards. That is, data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Currently, it is a static database, but in the next report cycle, we aim to integrate it with sand-based databases, so the most recent version is available to all. There is still a long way before we will have a comprehensive list of all alien species present in the country, which is essential for determining whether new alien species can be brought in legally. But the processes are now in place to add new data in the coming years. The second report highlights changes in species ranges, where some show increases. Range here is measured as occupancy of species at a quarter-degree grid cell scale in South Africa. One of the major concerns is that for those invasive species, where we do have some estimate of their range size, almost half have increased in extent since the first report. Sungai gave some vivid anecdotes of the impact of alien species in South Africa, and I want to give one more that illustrates how impacts cut across different disciplines. It's been over 40 years since the first report of the German wasp in South Africa, and for several years it was reported to be confined to the Cape Peninsula. However, more than 2 decades later, its range expanded to some 50 kilometers from Cape Town. While the wasp has not to date had significant environmental impacts, they are currently largely restricted to urban or agricultural areas. Wasps are a growing hazard to agricultural workers and those who just want to enjoy being outside. In an attempt to curb the impacts of the insect, the City of Cape Town, Stellenbosch University, and SANBI collaborated with the help of the public. Between 2014 and 2018, across its distributional range, 232 nests have been destroyed. The control program is still ongoing. What the wasp illustrates clearly is that the issue of biological invasions is often cross-cutting, affecting the environment, agriculture, and human health. Modeling studies predict that it may spread towards the Eastern Cape. However, one criticism of the discipline has been that different impacts are measured in very different ways. I'm pleased to say that since the first report, there have been significant international developments into standardizing how the impacts of alien species are scored. The ACAT and SACAT frameworks were developed in collaboration with South African scientists, with ACAT being adopted last year by the UN. The first ACAT coordinator, Dr. Sabrina Kumschek, is employed through the CIB and SANBI partnership. Preliminary results for South Africa on invasive grasses and fishes identified 7 alien species as causing major or massive negative environmental impacts, and socioeconomic assessments for gastropods and mammals identified 1 species with major negative impacts. There is much more to be done, but in the coming reports, we aim to complete a comprehensive assessment of the impact of all invasive species in South Africa, much in the same way that SANBI is playing a leading role in producing and updating a red list of its entire flora. In terms of interventions to address invasive species, about a third of South Africa's 566 listed invasive alien species are managed to some degree, but the bulk of funds are spent on a relatively small number of invasive alien plant species. Over 40 high-risk species with currently restricted distributions are targets for national eradication, although none have yet been confirmed as eradicated. Biological control of invasive alien plants has proved to be highly effective, but for a few species, but very helpful as a complementary approach in combination with mechanical clearing for several others. Returns on investment from biological control have exceeded 1,000 Rand for every Rand invested. Recent evaluation of biocontrol have shown incredible success, and a typical example is the release of the water lettuce weevil on the water lettuce, as seen on the current slide, where picture A is before biocontrol deployment and picture B is the result. Such estimates of the success of biocontrol were only possible due to detailed monitoring. Data on the distribution and abundance of alien species need to be collected, collated, and integrated into national and global databases in order to facilitate the planning of interventions. The report relied heavily on historical investment in monitoring and research. Continued foundational research and monitoring will ensure that South Africa can continue to detect and manage future biological invasions and provide the evidence base to discuss conflicts of interest and inform the allocation of limited resources. In the next section, my colleague Tenda will look at the issue from the perspective of invaded sites themselves.
Thank you, Sia. Alien species have been introduced and become invasive in almost every ecosystem in South Africa. The map shown here is of invasive plant species richness at the scale of quarter-degree grid cells. The shaded cells are where we have recorded invasive plant species. And as you can see, the sites with most invasive species are along the coast and in urban areas. Only in a few of the most remote and arid regions are where invasive plant species are still to be recorded. This data is based on the South African Plant Invader Atlas, also known as SAPIA, a project started 40 years ago, which is an incredibly valuable resource and a great advert for low-cost, long-term monitoring that needs to continue and be complemented with other forms of monitoring, such as citizen science data and data from remote sensing technology. Every water catchment in South Africa is invaded by invasive fishes, many with several invasive fish species. Our seas are also heavily invaded, and there are 35 invasive terrestrial species recorded from Prince Edward Islands. Perhaps the only positive news is that offshore marine areas are not invaded, but there have been no extensive monitoring to date, which is a significant gap. So, looking at the combined impacts of all invasions, what does this mean at a site level? To give one example, if we look again at the invasive plant species richness map, and we overlay areas that provide water to the major cities of South Africa, also known as the strategic water source areas, it is clear that invasive species richness is higher in these areas. Invasive trees are estimated to use up 3 to 5% of South Africa's surface water runoff. This might seem small, but what this actually means is that Day Zero in Cape Town was brought forward by 60 days due to invasive trees, and drought-stricken areas such as the Eastern Cape can similarly be tipped over the edge. So removing invasive trees from catchments is one of the most cost-effective actions in our fight to drought-proof South Africa. Looking at other headline impacts, invasive plants are changing the nature of fires across the country. For example, the fires in the Southern Cape in 2017 burned longer and stronger due to invasive trees. And as Tsongai mentioned, Prosopis and Parthenium are amongst many other invaders that are negatively impacting commercial livestock production, but perhaps more importantly having devastating impact on rural communities. Reduction in grazing means fewer or lower value sheep and cattle, and therefore harder for people to make a living. Finally, in terms of biodiversity Biological invasions are responsible for 25% of all biodiversity loss to date, and half of all species threatened by extinction in South Africa are impacted by biological invasions. So, what is being done about the problem? The management of invaded sites is carried out by national, provincial, and local conservation authorities, and by private landowners, largely using the support from the Department Environmental Programs. The clearing has been strategically linked to job creation and poverty alleviation, with the aim of creating a win-win. Anecdotal reports, backed up by modeling work, suggest that significant impacts of clearing are possible, but only about 1.5% of invaded land has been addressed to date. And clearing efforts is monitored in terms of hectares treated rather than progress towards goals, such as reduction or reversal in rate of spread. A major success has been the development of techniques to remove invasive fishes, including bass, bluegill, and carp from the stretches of water. In each case, there has been significant recovery of native biodiversity. This has created opportunity to reclaim our native streams and rivers from invasions. However, there is clearly a need to seriously consider conservation triage and to focus scarce available funds on priority areas so that they can be used effectively. This will rely on improved monitoring of control effectiveness. With that, I will hand back to Tsungai, who will discuss interventions.
Thank you, Tender. Finally, I want to present some findings of interventions that cut across pathways, species, and sites. There are encouraging signs that current regulations are becoming effective. These regulations have been increasingly used to grant permits for the possession and use of listed invasive species in ways that limit the threat they pose. The report documents a case of a successful prosecution of an offender who contravened the regulations by not clearing invaded land. Several other offenses have been since prosecuted successfully. Changes to the regulations and the list of invasive species have been made, but only after this report was finalized. Their effectiveness will be assessed as part of the upcoming third report. A process has also been set up to ensure that all future changes to the list of invasive species will be formed by a newly standardized, formal science-based risk analysis process. A national strategy would provide interdepartmental vision to address the societal problem and provide justification for government investment. The environmental programs of the department invest around 1 billion rands every year into programs that assist government and private landowners with the control of invasive species. This is a large underestimate, as it does not include investments made by other arms of government, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector. And the real cost of control operations will be considerably more. In terms of government spending, there is a focus on controlling a relatively small number of the most damaging species. The development of comprehensive management plans to guide the control of biological invasions is vital for success. Plans need to be in place for pathways of introduction, priority species, and for priority invaded sites, like protected areas. Both NEMBA and its alien and invasive species regulations make provision for this. Some plans have been developed, for example on the Polyphogus short-haul borer, as I discussed earlier, but there is a need for improvement and expansion. For example, the process for the formal adaptation of species-level control and eradication plans is not clear. One really positive development has been the production of a comprehensive plans to eradicate invasive mice from Gulf and Marion Islands. Mice kill about 5% of all albatross chicks on Marion each year. If successful, this eradication will be the largest island from which invasive rodents have been eradicated and will be a significant credit to South Africa globally. To wrap up, the report, we believe, does much to confirm that biological invasions have had severe impacts on all sectors of society. They are a major threat to South Africa's biodiversity, economy, and sustainable development, but they can be dealt with if effective control measures are implemented. The causes, impacts, and how we respond to biological invasions cuts across sectors such as biodiversity, agriculture, trade, and health. And therefore, it is critical that we have an integrated approach to dealing with these challenges. South Africa is a global leader in understanding and managing evasions, but we need to ensure that capacity is retained for foundational research, for policy making, for management, and for monitoring and evaluation, so we can both deal with current invasions like the Polyphogus short-haul borer and future invasions that we do not know what they are yet, but we know they are on their way. The report has highlighted key areas that need strengthening in how South Africa responds to biological invasions. This is an area that is constantly evolving, and we need to ensure that systems deliver, and the report plays an important role in helping us determine where there are gaps and where tweaks are needed in the system. I would like to end this presentation by acknowledging the numerous partners involved in developing this report, my fellow authors, contributors, and the funders. We have also provided a list of key links and contacts if you need additional information. Thank you.